My parents chose my sister for their dream trip to Spain and left me behind, without a second thought, never knowing. I would strip their house bare while they were away. I was 29 years old, sitting at my parents' dinner table, when my mother told me they could only afford to take one daughter to Spain. My name is Emma Grant. I'm a certified accountant. I count money for a living. For 10 years, I'd been paying my family's bills without even realizing it. The dinner started normal. I cooked the chicken myself, the recipe with the rosemary my mother liked, the one I'd been making at that table since I was 16. I folded the napkins the way she always wanted, into those tight triangles she'd learned from a magazine in 1994 and never let go of, pressed sharp enough to hold their shape even after they hit the placemats. The kitchen smelled like garlic and lemon, and the candle my mother lit for company, even when the only company was me. Then she smiled that smile she only used when she'd already decided something and just needed me to hear it out loud. "We have exciting news," she said. She set her wine glass down like she was about to give a toast. "Your father and I are taking Chloe to Spain this summer." I put my fork down slow. "Both of you? Just her?" "We can't afford 2 tickets, sweetie," she said, like the math had only just occurred to her, like she hadn't already priced 3 flights and picked the cheapest configuration. "You understand." I understood everything. I understood the 11 times I'd covered their mortgage in the last 4 years. I understood the new refrigerator sitting in their kitchen, the couch I'd bought them for their anniversary, the television bolted to the living room wall that I'd paid $600 to have professionally mounted. I understood the $4,100 auto loan I'd co-signed so my father could drive a truck he couldn't otherwise afford. All of it quiet, all of it unspoken, all of it expected, the way rain is expected in April. My sister Chloe barely looked up from her plate. She was 25 and she'd been mid-bite through the whole announcement, like it was a weather report, like it didn't concern her at all because of course it didn't. Nothing that happened to her ever felt like something she'd caused. "Don't worry, Em," she said, wiping her mouth. "I'll send pictures." "How generous," I said. She smiled like she hadn't heard the edge in my voice. She never did. That was the thing about Chloe. She floated through life on a current she didn't even know existed, and the current was me. My father chuckled at that, not unkindly, just careless, the way you'd laugh at a comment you weren't really listening to, like I was a joke that didn't need explaining, one everyone else was already in on. Something in me went cold and clear, the way a room goes quiet right before a storm. I finished dinner. I washed every dish by hand because their dishwasher had been broken since February, and nobody had asked me to fix it, though I probably would have if they'd asked. I said goodnight like nothing had happened. Then I drove home, and I opened my laptop, and I started building something I would later call reality. I need to explain how a 29-year-old woman ends up quietly financing her parents' life without anyone ever calling it what it was. I grew up in Millbrook, Ohio, in a split-level house on Larkspur Lane, with green shutters my father repainted every 5 years whether they needed it or not. My father, Richard Grant, worked as an electrician for 31 years before his back gave out, and he went semi-retired, which meant he took small jobs when he felt like it and complained about his knees the rest of the time. My mother, Linda Grant, worked part-time doing the books for our church, First Trinity Lutheran, a detail I've always found funny in hindsight, because she managed the church's money more carefully than she ever managed her own. My mother's job at First Trinity paid barely $12 an hour, 3 afternoons a week, reconciling the offering plate totals and the building fund ledger with a precision she never once applied to her own checking account, which sat overdrawn more months than not. Chloe worked part-time at a dental office in Millbrook, answering phones and scheduling cleanings, a job she'd held for 3 years without ever once mentioning a raise or a promotion. Content, it seemed, to let her life stay exactly the size it already was. I don't say that to be unkind. I say it because it's the plainest way I know to describe the difference between us. I was always building towards something. Chloe was always waiting to be given something. Neither of those is a moral failing on its own, but in a house with limited resources and 2 daughters, it meant one of us kept asking for more, and one of us kept quietly supplying it. Chloe came 4 years after me, and from the day she was born, she was the fragile one. There was a reason for that, or at least a story the family told itself to make sense of it. Chloe had severe asthma as a kid, 3 hospitalizations before she turned 7, one bad enough that my parents slept in shifts outside the pediatric ICU at Riverside Methodist for 4 nights straight. I remember that, even though I was only 11. I remember being dropped at Aunt Carol's house with a duffel bag and no explanation, and I remember understanding, without anyone saying it, that Chloe's needs came first because Chloe's needs had once been a matter of whether she'd keep breathing. The problem is that Chloe grew out of the asthma by the time she was 14. The protection never grew out of anything. It just kept living in the house long after the reason for it was gone, the way a smoke alarm keeps chirping long after the battery's dead, out of habit more than function. By the time I was 19, I was already doing my parents' taxes. I'd gotten good with numbers early, good enough that a professor at Ohio State pulled me aside sophomore year and told me I should think seriously about accounting instead of the vague business degree I'd been drifting toward. I did. I got my CPA license at 24. I started at a firm called Bennett & Cole Financial Group in downtown Columbus, 40 minutes from Millbrook, close enough to visit on Sundays, far enough to have my own apartment at the Willowbrook complex off Route 9. The first time I paid one of their bills, I was 22. It was a gas bill, $68, and my mother called crying because they'd gotten the shut-off notice and my father was too proud to ask his brother, my Uncle Gary, for help again. I paid it without thinking twice. That's the trap. It never feels like a decision the first time. It feels like love. By 24, it was the electric bill some months and the water bill others. By 26, it was $500 toward Chloe's wedding centerpieces when she got engaged to a man named Marcus Doyle, because my mother said the florist needed a deposit that week and there was nowhere else to get it. I remember writing that check. $850 made out to Ferris and Vine Florals. Nobody ever mentioned paying me back, and I never asked because asking felt like putting a price tag on my sister's happiness. And what kind of person does that? By 27, I was the one who noticed the mortgage on Larkspur Lane was 2 months behind because my mother mentioned it in passing the way you'd mention the weather. No urgency in her voice at all, like she already knew what would happen next. I covered it 11 times over 4 years. I want to be precise about that because precision is the only thing that ever protected me. Some months it was the full payment, $1,420. Some months it was just enough to keep the bank from calling again. The car loan is the one I think about most now. In the spring I turned 28. My father wanted a used Ford F-150, and his credit was bad enough that the dealership in Millbrook wouldn't finance him a loan. He asked me to co-sign $4,100. I remember sitting in the finance office at Heritage Ford, my father in the chair next to me, practically vibrating with excitement over a truck he'd wanted since he was younger than I was. I remember thinking, even then, this is my name on the line, not his. There was an earlier moment, though, one I didn't understand the weight of until much later. 2 summers before the dinner that changed everything, my parents took a trip to the Outer Banks with Chloe and Marcus, just the 4 of them. I found out about it from a Facebook photo. My mother in a sun hat on a beach in Nag's Head, my father grilling something on a rented deck, Chloe holding a piña colada she was legally 2 years too young to be drinking. Nobody had called to tell me they were going. Nobody had called to ask if I wanted to come. When I asked my mother about it later, she said, "Oh, honey, it was such short notice. We didn't want to bother you at work." I let that sit for about 4 seconds before I said, "Okay," and changed the subject, the way you do when you've already decided not to look directly at something because you're not ready for what you'll see. There's another memory from further back that I still think about, one I didn't connect to any of this until much later. I was 10. My father took just me, no Chloe, up to Kokosing Lake for a weekend of fishing. The 2 of us in a rented aluminum boat that smelled like gasoline and lake water. He taught me how to bait a hook without flinching. He told me I was the steady one, said it like a compliment, said it like it settled something. I carried that phrase around for almost 20 years like a badge before I understood what it had actually cost me. Steady meant reliable. Reliable meant available. Available, eventually, meant expected. There was a moment in high school, too, that I didn't think much of until years later. I was 17, working my first job at a frozen yogurt shop in the strip mall off Route 3, saving toward a car of my own. Chloe was 13, and she'd taken my father's old Buick out to the church parking lot to practice turns, unsupervised, and clipped a light pole hard enough to crack the front bumper and dent the fender. My parents were furious for exactly 1 evening. Then my mother sat me down and asked, gently, whether I might put some of my yogurt shop savings toward the deductible, since Chloe already felt terrible enough and didn't need the added stress of hearing about the money. I gave them $320, nearly everything I'd saved that summer. Chloe never heard about it. I made sure of that myself, actually, because at 17, I still believed protecting her from consequences was a kindness I was choosing, rather than a role I'd been assigned. A co-worker of mine, Priya Nair, sat 2 desks down from me at Bennett & Cole for 6 years before any of this happened, and she was usually the one who said out loud what I couldn't yet let myself hear. I remember her watching me transfer $400 to my parents from my desk one lunch hour, my face doing whatever face it did back then, and she said, not unkindly, "You know you don't actually owe them an audit trail of your own kindness, right? You're allowed to just say no." I laughed it off at the time. I told her it wasn't a big deal, that it was just how my family worked. She didn't push. But she remembered, and months later, after the dinner, after the folder, she was the first person outside of Diane Foster I told the real number to. She didn't look surprised. She just said, $112,000, slowly, like she was trying to make the number sit still long enough for me to actually see it. "Emma, that's a house. That's a literal house." I want to be fair here because fairness matters to me, maybe more than it should. My parents weren't monsters. My father taught me to change a tire in the driveway of the Larkspur house when I was 16, patient in a way he rarely was about anything else. My mother used to sit with me during exam weeks in college, quizzing me on accounting formulas she didn't understand, just so I wouldn't be alone with the stress. There was real love in that house. I don't want to erase that even now, but love in my family had a currency, and I was the one who kept making deposits nobody ever intended to match. By the time I sat down at that dinner table at 29 years old, I had given my parents somewhere around $100,000 over 10 years, though I hadn't done the exact math yet. I didn't know the number would end up being $112,000 until I sat down that night with my laptop and made myself count every single transfer, every check, every Venmo request marked just this once. What I knew sitting at that table was simpler than any number. I knew that when it came time to choose, they chose Chloe. They always had. I had just never seen it laid out quite so plainly before. 2 plane tickets and a silence where mine should have been. I didn't say any of that at dinner. there. I said, "That's great, Mom," and I meant for it to sound flat enough that she'd hear it, and she didn't, because she never did. The 6 weeks that followed were the strangest of my life, because I spent them being the best daughter I have ever been. 2 weeks after that dinner, my mother texted me a link to a viewing platform tour of the Sagrada Familia, and underneath it, almost as an afterthought, a request. "The excursions package for Barcelona is $600 more than we budgeted. Any chance you could help? We'll pay you back after the estate sale this fall." I didn't know what estate sale she meant. I didn't ask. I sent $600 through Venmo that same night, and I took a screenshot of the transaction the way I'd started taking screenshots of everything, a habit I couldn't yet name a reason for. A week after that, my father called about Grandma Dorothy. She's 86, my father's mother, living at Maple Ridge Senior Living on the north side of Millbrook, and her memory care copay had gone up $380 a month starting in April. "We can't exactly cover that and the trip both," my father said, his voice doing the thing it does when he wants something and doesn't want to sound like he's asking. "Your mother's worried sick about it. You know how she gets." I sent the money for 2 months in advance, $760. I told myself it wasn't about the trip. I told myself it was about my grandmother, a woman who used to slip me $5 bills at Christmas and tell me not to tell my sister, because Chloe would only spend it on candy and I'd put mine in a savings account. And she liked that about me. She always liked that about me. The third time, it wasn't even them who called. It was my Aunt Carol, my mother's sister, phoning me on a Tuesday evening while I was still in my work clothes. "Your mother says you've been dragging your feet on the Spain fund," she said. No hello, no preamble. I hadn't dragged my feet on anything. I'd simply asked, gently, whether the 600 and the 760 were connected, whether there was a running total, somewhere I should know about. Apparently that question had traveled through my mother, through the family group chat, and landed on my aunt's tongue, reshaped into something uglier. "Family doesn't count pennies, Emma," Aunt Carol said. "You've got a good job. It wouldn't kill you to be generous for once." I didn't say no, I told her. I asked how much total I'd already sent. "Your mother says it feels like an interrogation," Aunt Carol said. "She says you've always had this streak in you, ever since you were little, needing everything to add up before you'll help. Not everyone in this family thinks in spreadsheets, Emma. Some of us just show up for each other." I sat on my couch after that call for a long time, phone in my lap, feeling something I didn't have a name for yet but would later learn to call clarity. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show, linked in the description, for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. The fourth time was the one that finally showed me the shape of the whole thing. I'd gone to Larkspur Lane on a Sunday to drop off groceries, the way I always did, and my father caught me in the kitchen while my mother was upstairs steaming Chloe's dresses for the trip. "You've been weird lately," he said, arms crossed, leaning against the counter I'd bought them 2 Christmases before. "Distant. Your mother's noticed it too." "I'm not being distant," I said. "I asked a question about money, that's all." "See, that's exactly it," he said, and his voice took on that wounded, patient tone I'd heard him use on customers who complained about his invoices. "You've always made things about money. Ever since you got that fancy job, you act like the rest of us are beneath you. You think we don't notice you keeping score?" I stood there with a gallon of milk still in my hand, genuinely unsure for a second, whether he believed what he'd just said, or whether he'd simply reached for the nearest weapon. Looking back, I think it was both. I think my father had built a version of events where I was cold and calculating, and he was a simple man trying to hold a family together, and he believed it completely, because believing anything else would have required him to sit with what he'd actually done. "I'm not keeping score," I said quietly. "I just want to understand what I'm paying for." "You're not paying for anything," he snapped. "You're helping your family. There's a difference, Emma, and if you can't see that, maybe you need to think about what kind of daughter you want to be. What kind of daughter has paid your mortgage 11 times in 4 years?" I asked, and I heard my own voice come out steadier than I felt. "What kind of daughter co-signed a truck loan she'll be paying off if you ever miss a payment?" "I'm asking a question, Dad. I'm not accusing anyone of anything." He set his coffee mug down harder than the moment called for, the sound sharp against the counter I'd bought them. "You think because you make good money now, you get to talk to me like that? I raised you. I put a roof over your head for 18 years. You don't get to come in here and act like a bank auditing a bad loan." "I'm not auditing anything," I said, though even as I said it, some part of me recognized the shape of exactly what I'd already started doing, quietly, every night, on my laptop. "I asked one question about $600. It's never one question with you," he said. "It's never just one thing. Your mother and I do everything we can for this family, and you sit there counting nickels like we owe you a receipt for loving you." I didn't argue. I put the milk in the refrigerator. I said I had to get going. On my way out, my mother caught me in the hallway, and in the middle of asking whether I'd remembered to buy the good coffee creamer, she said something I almost missed entirely. "You know," she said, folding one of Chloe's linen dresses over her arm, "this house will always take care of whoever needs it most. That's just how your father and I think about it." She said it lightly, like a passing thought, the kind of thing that means nothing until it means everything. I nodded and said something about the creamer being in the bag, and I drove home without thinking about it again for 11 days. The 5th time came 4 days before they left for the airport. Chloe called me, breezy as always, and asked if she could use my car for the 2 weeks they'd be gone. Since hers was in the shop for a transmission issue Marcus said would take a while. She also asked, almost as an afterthought, if I could give Marcus the spare key to my apartment, just in case he needs needs to grab something for me while I'm away, which struck me as an odd request for a woman going to Spain with our parents, since anything she needed would presumably already be packed. What would he need to grab? I asked. God, Em, it's not a whole thing, she said, laughing a little, the way she laughed at everything that made her uncomfortable to actually answer. Just some stuff for the wedding planning. Don't be weird about it. I said no to the key. I said yes to the car because I could take the bus to work for 2 weeks and it seemed like a small thing, and because some part of me, even then, wanted one more piece of evidence, one more small transaction I could point to later and say, this is what it always looked like. The 6th time came 2 nights before the flight, and it was the one that finally showed me how far my family was willing to reach. Chloe called me at nearly 11, crying in a way that sounded real, because with Chloe, it usually was, even when the tears were doing someone else's work. The venue for the wedding, a barn outside Granville booked for the following spring, had raised its deposit requirement by $900 with less than a week's notice, some clause about liability insurance she hadn't read closely enough. Mom says you're the only one who has this kind of money just sitting around, she said, her voice thick. I don't want to ask you this right before you leave for Spain, Em, but I don't know what else to do. If I lose the barn, I lose the whole date. Marcus's parents already told his cousins November 8th. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment, thinking about the deed I didn't yet know existed, about the 11 mortgage payments, about a version of myself that would have transferred the money before she'd even finished the sentence. I can't tonight, I finally said. Let me think about it while you're away. Wow, she said, and the crying stopped almost immediately, replaced by something flatter and more familiar. Okay, I guess I'll figure it out myself then. Enjoy having the moral high ground, I guess. She hung up before I could answer. My mother called 40 minutes later, her voice pitched low and reasonable in the way she used when she wanted to sound like the only adult in the room. You don't have to help if you don't want to, she said, but I hope you understand what it means if your sister loses that venue over $900 you could easily spare. That's the kind of thing a family remembers, Emma. I told her I understood completely, and I meant it in a way she didn't intend. I understood, finally and fully, that no ceiling in that house was ever really a ceiling. There was always another floor built quietly above it, waiting for me to climb. By the time my parents' suitcases were zipped and lined up by the front door, I had photographed 180 items in that house. I had matched receipts to purchases going back 6 years. I had a folder on my laptop labeled Reality, 47 pages by the time I finished, organized by date, by amount, by item, with a running total at the top of the first page that I checked more often than I probably should have. I'd also found a lawyer. Her name was Diane Foster, recommended by a colleague at Bennett & Cole who'd used her for a business dispute 2 years earlier. I sat across from her in her office on the 3rd floor of a building on High Street, a corner window looking out over the traffic below, my laptop open, my 47 pages printed and stapled, and I told her everything. The dinner, the 11 mortgage payments, the $4,100 loan, the $600 for excursions, the Outer Banks trip I'd found out about from a photo. All of it, in the flat, itemized voice I use when I'm presenting an audit to a client who doesn't want to hear bad news dressed up as anything softer than it is. She listened without interrupting once, taking notes on a legal pad in handwriting so neat it looked almost typed. Twice she asked me to slow down so she could get an amount exactly right, and both times I appreciated it more than I could say, because it was the first conversation I'd had in 10 years where someone wanted my numbers to be precise for my own protection rather than someone else's convenience. When I finished, she took her glasses off and set them on the desk. How much of this is documented? She asked. All of it, I said. Every dollar. Then here's what I'll tell you, she said. Anything you can prove you purchased, anything titled in your name or paid for entirely with your own funds, is legally yours. You can take it. You don't need their permission, and you don't need to explain yourself to anyone. She paused. But I'd tell you to leave while they're gone, not to sneak, to document and to leave clearly, with a paper trail a child could follow. Take only what's yours, nothing more. And if they call the police? I asked. Then you'll be very glad you have 47 pages, she said. For 6 weeks, I played the perfect daughter. I helped Chloe pack her suitcase, folding her white linen pants the way my mother had taught me, the same tight creases she liked. I drove my parents to get their passport photos redone when my father's came out blurry. I listened to my father complain about airport parking rates at John Glenn International and nodded in all the right places. Every night, after I left them, I sat in my apartment and worked on the folder. I cross-referenced, I photographed, I built, piece by piece, a case for a crime that hadn't happened yet, and depending on how you looked at it, maybe never would. It was during one of those nights, 3 weeks before the trip, that I found the thing that changed everything. I'd gone back to Larkspur Lane on a Wednesday to drop off a birthday card for my father's upcoming 63rd birthday, and my mother asked me to grab a stack of old tax documents from the filing cabinet in what used to be my father's home office, so she could send copies to their accountant before they left. The filing cabinet was the same one that had been there since I was in high school. 3 drawers, a little rusted at the hinges. I found the folder she wanted in the top drawer. In the bottom drawer, tucked behind a stack of old utility bills I recognized because half of them had my name on the payment record, I found a manila envelope labeled, in my mother's handwriting, Estate. I want to say I hesitated before opening it. I didn't. I'd spent 6 weeks building a folder called Reality, and some instinct, some cold accountant's instinct that had served me well for a decade, told me this envelope belonged in it. Inside was a quitclaim deed dated September of 2 years earlier, transferring the property at 114 Larkspur Lane, in full, to Chloe Marie Grant, recorded at the Knox County Recorder's Office. Notarized, legal, done. Underneath the deed was a letter, on the letterhead of an estate attorney named Walter Hensley, addressed to my parents. I read it twice, because the first time, I don't think I let myself fully absorb it. The letter referenced a conversation the three of them had had in his office. It said, in language far more polite than the truth deserved, that given Emma's financial stability and independence, and Chloe's ongoing need for a secure living situation post-marriage, the transfer, as discussed, provides the most appropriate asset protection for the family's long-term needs. I sat on the floor of that office for a long time, the envelope in my lap, the deed and the letter spread out on the carpet in front of me like evidence at a crime scene, which, in a sense, they were. Somewhere upstairs, I could hear my mother running the vacuum, oblivious, and the ordinary hum of it against the quiet I was sitting in felt almost cruel, like the house itself hadn't noticed anything had changed. I thought about all the nights I'd sat at this same desk as a teenager doing homework while my father watched television down the hall, and how none of those nights had ever hinted that a decision like this one was already being made somewhere just out of sight, in an attorney's office I'd never once been invited to. Every mortgage payment I'd made for 4 years, every one of those 11 times I'd covered them so the bank wouldn't call again, had gone toward a house that already had a name on the deed, and it wasn't mine, and it never would be. My stability hadn't been rewarded. It had been used as the justification for cutting me out. Chloe's fragility, real once, invented for years afterward, had been rewarded with a house. My reliability had been rewarded with the privilege of paying for a house I would never own. I thought about my father saying, "This house will always take care of whoever needs it most." I thought about the word needs, and how carefully my family had defined it to never once include me. I put the deed and the letter back exactly where I'd found them. I didn't confront anyone that night. I went home, and I added a new page to the reality folder, and at the top of it, I wrote a single line. They already decided. I just didn't know when. The morning they left for the airport, my mother kissed my cheek at the door of Larkspur Lane, her carry-on already slung over one shoulder. "Keep an eye on the mail, sweetie," she said. "I will," I said. Chloe hugged me, quick and light, already halfway to the car in her mind. "Don't mess with my room." "I won't," I said. And I meant that literally, because her room was the one place in that house I had no intention of touching. Everything I took, I could prove was mine. Nothing in her room qualified. And I wasn't there for what belonged to her. I was there for what belonged to me. My father loaded the last suitcase into the trunk of the car that would take them to the airport. "Try to enjoy the quiet," he said, the closest thing to a joke he had left in him for me. "I will," I said, and I meant it more than he knew. I watched their car turn the corner off Larkspur Lane. Then I called David Reyes. David ran a small moving crew out of a warehouse near the fairgrounds, referred to me by a coworker who'd used him for an office relocation the year before, the kind of guy who didn't ask questions as long as the paperwork was in order. I met him and his crew at the house 40 minutes after my parents' plane was scheduled to leave the gate. I handed him my folder at the door, the whole 49 pages by then. "Everything I'm taking is documented in here," I told him. "If you're ever not sure whether something's mine, stop and ask me before you touch it." He flipped through the first several pages, receipts clipped to photographs, dates lining up in neat columns. He looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You point," he said. "We carry." We started with the television. Watching it come off that wall felt like watching a clock stop mid-tick. Then the couch, the one I'd bought for their 15th anniversary, hauled out through a front door it had never once left through. Then the 2 armchairs from 2 Christmases before, the fabric still holding the shape of my father's body from 30 years of sitting in the same spot every evening. The refrigerator hummed one last time in the driveway before we unplugged it for good, its ice maker still cycling out cubes onto the asphalt like it hadn't gotten the news yet. David's crew wrapped the washer and dryer next. The set I'd bought 2 years earlier when the old ones finally gave out, $640 I remembered writing into a check because my mother had said cash felt too transactional for a gift. We took the dining table I'd bought secondhand and refinished myself over a single humid August weekend, sanding it down on the back patio while my father watched from his chair and told me I was better at that kind of thing than he'd ever been. A compliment that had felt like praise for years before it started to feel like a job description. We took the coffee table I'd built from a kit 2 Christmases back, the one with the slightly uneven leg my father had laughed at gently, the year I gave it to them. I left the laugh where I found it. I took the table. By 2 in the afternoon, we were in my old bedroom, the one I'd grown up in, the one that still had boxes of my things stacked in the closet from a life I'd technically already moved out of years ago. By 4 o'clock, the house looked like a question nobody had ever thought to ask out loud. Pale rectangles on the walls where framed photos had hung for a decade, dents pressed into the carpet where furniture had sat so long the fibers had given up trying to spring back. I placed one envelope on the empty kitchen counter, the one flat surface left in the whole house. One word on the front, written in my own handwriting this time, not my mother's. Family. Inside, every dollar, every year, every date, listed in order, $112,000 totaled at the bottom in a font I'd chosen because it looked less like an accusation and more like a bank statement, which, in a way, it was. Underneath the total, 2 lines. I am done being the second daughter. daughter. I am done being the first person called when money is needed. I set my house key on top of the envelope. I walked out the front door. I didn't look back, though I'll admit, all these months later, that not looking back took more effort than anything else I did that day. 3 days later, I was sitting on a cabin porch outside Hocking Hills, borrowed from a coworker who owed me a favor, when my phone finally found a signal strong enough to load anything. 41 missed calls stacked up on the screen, voicemails piling in by the minute, my mother's voice climbing higher and thinner with each one, my father's voice underneath hers, flat with something that wasn't quite anger yet and would become it soon. Then one message loaded slower than the rest, sent from a number I didn't recognize, time-stamped that same morning, Eastern Time, while I imagined they were still standing in the wreckage of their own living room. It said my father had gone to the Millbrook Police Department, not to report the missing furniture, to report me. I read that message twice on the porch, the wood cool under my bare feet, a hawk circling somewhere over the tree line like it had nowhere better to be. I felt, underneath the fear that any reasonable person would feel at those words, something steadier. I had 49 pages. I had Diane Foster's number saved under a name I'd typed in capital letters. I had a deed, memorized now, word for word, that told a story my father had no idea I already knew. I called Diane before I called my mother back. They're saying it's theft, I told her. Did you take anything you can't document? She asked. No. Then let them file, she said. I'll meet you at the station tomorrow morning. Bring the folder, all 49 pages. I drove back to Millbrook that night, 3 hours through dark that felt heavier than dark usually does, replaying every version of the conversation I was about to have. I kept coming back to one thing, over and over. The way you worry a loose tooth with your tongue even though you know it'll hurt. My father had gone to the police before he'd even called me. He hadn't wanted an explanation. He'd wanted a conviction, and he'd wanted it before the truth had a chance to get in the way. The Millbrook Police Department sits on Elm Street, a low brick building next to the fire station, the kind of place that mostly handles noise complaints and fender benders. I walked in at 9 the next morning with Diane Foster beside me, the folder tucked under her arm instead of mine, because she said it would land better coming from a lawyer than a daughter. My father was already there, sitting in a plastic chair against the far wall, my mother beside him, both of them looking like people who hadn't slept in 3 days, which, judging by the state of my mother's hair, might have been true. Chloe wasn't with them at first. I found out later she'd been sitting in the car in the parking lot, unwilling to come inside, which told me more about her than anything she'd said to me in the 6 weeks before the trip. She came in about 10 minutes into everything, slipping into a chair near the door like she was hoping no one would notice the timestamp on her arrival. She wouldn't look at me. She kept her eyes on her phone, thumb moving over the screen in short, nervous strokes, and I remember thinking, even in the middle of everything else happening in that room, that this was the most honest thing she'd done in the whole 6 weeks. She'd shown up late, and she'd shown up looking away. My father stood up when he saw me. "There she is," he said to the officer at the front desk, loud enough for the whole waiting area to hear. "That's her. That's my daughter." "Mr. Grant," the officer said, "a woman named Detective Renata Ostrowski, according to the badge clipped to her blazer. Why don't we all sit down?" We sat in a small room off the main lobby, my father across from me, my mother beside him with her hands folded so tightly in her lap the knuckles had gone white. Diane laid the folder on the table and opened it to the first page. "Every item removed from the property at 114 Larkspur Lane on the date in question is documented here," Diane said, calm, unhurried, the way I imagined she talked juries into things. "Photographs, original receipts, dates of purchase, in most cases bank statements showing the funds came directly from Ms. Grant's personal accounts. Nothing was taken that wasn't already legally hers. That television was in our living room for 6 years," my father said, his voice rising. "That's our house. You paid for the wall mount installation," I said quietly. "I paid for the television. There's a receipt from Best Buy on Sawmill Road, dated 4 years ago, and the credit card statement showing the charge came off my account, not yours." Detective Ostrowski looked through several pages, unhurried, the way you'd expect someone to look through a stack of documents that were, frankly, more organized than most legal filings she probably saw in a week. She looked up at my father. "Mr. Grant, I understand this feels personal," she said, "but based on what's in front of me, this looks like a civil property matter, not a criminal one. Ms. Grant has documentation showing ownership of every item listed. I don't see grounds here for theft charges." My father's face did something I'd never seen it do before, a kind of collapse that started at his jaw and worked its way up, like watching a building lose its foundation floor by floor. "This is insane," he said. "She cleaned us out. She took everything." "I took what I paid for," I said. "You kept the house. You kept the deed. You've kept that for 2 years, actually, though I only found out 3 weeks ago." The room went quiet in a way that felt different from every other silence I'd sat through in that family. My mother's head turned toward my father, slow, like she was hoping she'd misheard. "What deed?" she said. I looked at my father, not my mother, because I already understood, sitting there, that this particular betrayal had 2 authors, but only 1 architect. "The quitclaim deed to Larkspur Lane," I said, "transferred to Chloe 2 years ago. I found the letter from Walter Hensley in the filing cabinet, the one that says my stability made me less of a priority for asset protection." I let that sentence sit in the room for a moment before I said the rest of it. "I paid 11 mortgage payments on a house I was never going to own, so that the daughter who never paid a cent of it could inherit it free and clear. I'd like someone here to explain to me how that isn't theft, because from where I'm sitting, it's a much bigger one than a television." My mother's hands came apart in her lap. She looked looked at my father with an expression I'd never seen her aim at him before, something between disbelief and a very old, very tired kind of anger. "Richard," she said, "you told me Emma knew about this. You told me she'd agreed to it." "I was going to tell her eventually," my father said, and his voice had lost its edge now, gone thin and defensive in a way that made him sound, for the first time in my life, small. "It wasn't like that. Chloe needed something solid, with the wedding coming, and you've always been fine, Emma. You've always landed on your feet. I didn't think it would matter to you." "It didn't need to matter to me," I said. "It needed to be honest. You let me keep paying for something you'd already given away. That's not favoritism, Dad. That's fraud with better manners." Detective Ostrowski cleared her throat, the sound of someone who'd seen a lot of family arguments happen in that small room and had learned exactly when to let them run and when to redirect them. "This is clearly a family matter that goes beyond what we handle here," she said. "Mr. Grant, I'd strongly advise against pursuing a criminal complaint. Based on this documentation, you'd be opening yourself up to significant liability if you did." My father didn't say anything else. He stood up, and for a moment I thought he might actually apologize, some small crack finally opening in 10 years of careful, comfortable blindness. Instead, he looked at me and said, "You've humiliated this family," and walked out of the room. My mother stayed seated a moment longer. She looked at me, and something in her face was trying to be soft, trying to reach for the version of us that used to sit together during exam weeks. "I didn't know he'd already done the paperwork," she said quietly. "I swear to you, Emma, I didn't know it was final." "But you knew the house would go to her," I said. "You told me yourself 3 weeks ago, standing in the hallway with Chloe's dresses on your arm. This house will take care of whoever needs it most. You just didn't think I'd ever find out what that meant in writing." She didn't have an answer for that. I don't think there was one that would have satisfied either of us. Chloe finally spoke then, her voice small in a way I'd never heard from her before. Not even during the asthma years I was too young to remember clearly. "I didn't ask for the house," she said. "I didn't even ask them to talk to Mr. Hensley. I swear, Em, I thought it was just something they were considering. I believed that part of it. What I didn't believe, and told her so, right there in that small municipal room, was that not asking made it acceptable to keep quiet once she understood what it meant. You knew the deed existed," I said. "You knew before I did. You just never once wondered what it would mean for the person still paying the mortgage on a house that was already yours." She didn't answer that. She looked down at her phone again, and I understood, watching her, that some people don't defend themselves because they've run out of excuses. They defend themselves by disappearing into the nearest quiet corner and waiting for someone else to absorb the consequences, the same way she'd waited in the car until it seemed safe to come inside. I stood up, thanked Detective Ostrowski, and walked out of the station with Diane Foster beside me into a July morning that felt, for the first time in 6 weeks, like it belonged entirely to me. The weeks after the police station were when the rest of the family found out, and families, I've learned, don't so much take sides as reveal the sides they'd already quietly chosen years earlier. My Uncle Gary called me 2 days after the station, his voice rough in a way I recognized from every difficult conversation he and my father had ever had. "Your dad told me his version," he said. "Then I called Walter Hensley's office myself, because your dad's version had holes in it big enough to drive that truck of his through. Emma, I'm sorry. I should have paid more attention to what was happening in that house a long time ago." He told me something else that week, too, something I hadn't known. He'd loaned my father $3,000 back in the spring, quietly, to cover part of the Spain trip, on the understanding it would be paid back once things settled down. He'd since stopped asking. "I think I was just the last stop before he got to you," he said. "I'm sorry I didn't see that sooner." Diane and I met twice more that fall, mostly logistics by then rather than strategy. She drafted a formal letter releasing me from any further claim on items I hadn't taken, in case my father tried months later to argue about something I'd left behind. She helped me file the paperwork to have my name fully struck from the truck loan once my father's refinance finally cleared in October, a process that took 11 phone calls to Heritage Ford's finance department and one increasingly terse email exchange with a loan officer who kept mixing up which grant was which. "You handled that folder better than most of my actual clients handle a divorce," Diane told me, the day we closed the file for good. "For what it's worth, I don't think this was ever really about a television. Grandma Dorothy found out from Uncle Gary before my father ever worked up the nerve to tell her himself. I visited her at Maple Ridge 2 weeks after the confrontation, brought her the peppermints she liked from the gas station on Route 3, and she held my hand across the little table in her room longer than she usually did. I gave your father money for that house's down payment 30 years ago," she told me, her voice steadier than I expected, "on the condition that whatever happened to it, it would be split fair between his children, whenever the time came. I trusted him to keep his word on that. I should have put it in writing myself." She squeezed my hand. "I'm changing a few things in my own will, Emma. Not out of spite, out of fairness. Somebody in this family should have thought of you the way you always thought of them." Aunt Carol, the same aunt who'd called me about family not counting pennies, phoned again in August, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "I said some things I shouldn't have," she admitted. "Your mother made it sound like you were being difficult over nothing. I didn't know about the house. I'm sorry, honey. I really am." Chloe was harder to read than any of them. She texted me a week after the police station, a long message that started with an apology and ended somewhere closer to an excuse, explaining that she hadn't known the deed was final either, that she'd assumed it was just something Dad was talking about, that that she felt caught in the middle of something she never asked to be part of. I believed some of it. I believed she genuinely hadn't tracked the details, because tracking details had never been her job in that family. It had been mine. But I also noticed she never once offered to sign the house back over, or split its value with me, or do anything beyond feeling bad about it in a way that cost her nothing. Marcus, to my surprise, was the one who pushed hardest. He called me himself in September, awkward and formal, a man clearly out of his depth in someone else's family drama, the kind of call I imagine took him several attempts to actually place. I didn't know about any of this when I proposed, he said. I want you to know that. If Chloe and I build a life in that house, I don't want it built on something you paid for and never got credit for. He told me he'd asked Chloe more than once whether she'd consider offering to split the home's value with me, or at least acknowledging it formally in some way, and that the conversations hadn't gone anywhere good. I've told her I think it's wrong, he said. I don't know what she'll do about it, but I wanted you to hear that from me, not through your mother. I appreciated that more than I expected to. It didn't fix anything, but it was the first time anyone outside my parents had looked at the situation and simply called it what it was, without needing me to prove it to them first. My father made 2 more attempts that fall, each smaller and more desperate than the last. The first was a letter, handwritten, that arrived at my apartment in October, 3 pages of looping cursive that alternated between blaming me for tearing this family apart over furniture and asking, almost in the same breath, whether I might reconsider helping out with Grandma Dorothy's care costs, since the family fund, as he put it, had dried up. I didn't respond. Diane had already sent him a letter of her own by then, formally ending my obligation on the truck loan and making clear, in language far more polished than anything I could have managed myself, that any further contact regarding financial assistance would be treated as harassment. The second attempt was smaller and sadder. He showed up at Bennett & Cole in November, waiting in the lobby until my supervisor came to tell me, gently, that my father was downstairs and wanted to talk. I went down. We stood by the elevator bank, fluorescent light doing nothing kind for either of our faces. I just want things back to normal, he said. There isn't a normal to go back to, I told him. There's just the version where I keep paying and you keep deciding, and I'm not doing that version anymore. He left without saying much else. I watched him walk out through the revolving door onto High Street, and something in me, underneath the relief, ached in a way I hadn't expected. I'd spent 6 weeks building a case against him with the precision of an audit. I hadn't built anything for the part of me that still, despite everything, wanted a father who didn't need to be audited in the first place. There was a Tuesday in late November when I drove past Larkspur Lane without meaning to, taking the long way home from a client meeting out of some habit my GPS hadn't caught up with yet. The green shutters were still there. Someone, my mother probably, had put a wreath on the door too early for the season. I sat at the stop sign at the end of the street longer than I needed to, thinking about the fishing trip at Kokosing Lake, about my father's hands showing mine how to bait a hook without flinching, about the version of him that existed before I understood what the steady one would eventually cost me. I thought too about my mother quizzing me on accounting formulas she didn't understand during exam week, patient in a way that had felt, at the time, like the whole point of having a mother at all. Grief is a strange thing to feel for people who are still alive, still reachable by phone, still capable, theoretically, of calling to apologize. But I grieved them anyway, sitting at that stop sign, because the parents I'd needed them to be, and the parents they'd actually been, had finally, fully, stopped overlapping, and there was no version of the truth left that let me pretend otherwise. I let myself grieve that version for exactly as long as it took the car behind me to tap its horn. Then I drove home. Thanksgiving came and went without me at Larkspur Lane for the first time in 29 years. Priya invited me to her family's table instead, a loud, warm gathering of aunts and cousins who argued about football and passed dishes without keeping a ledger of who'd contributed what. I sat at the end of her mother's table with a plate of food I hadn't cooked and hadn't paid for, and I cried a little in her kitchen afterward, not from grief exactly, more from the strange vertigo of realizing how unfamiliar it felt to be fed without it costing me something. Priya didn't ask questions. She just handed me a dish towel and let me have the moment. My mother texted me that same evening, a photo of the table at Larkspur Lane, my empty chair pushed in against the wall like it had never been used at all. Underneath it, she'd written, "We miss you today." I didn't respond for 2 days. When I finally did, I wrote back, "I miss what today used to be too," which was as honest as I could manage without opening a conversation neither of us was ready to finish. There were logistical things that took longer to untangle than I expected as well. Diane helped me formally remove my name from the auto loan, which required my father to refinance on his own, a process he resisted for 2 months before Heritage Ford's finance office forced his hand with a 90-day notice. I closed out the small family emergency fund I'd quietly kept auto-depositing into for 3 years, $400 a month that had never once, I realized when I finally traced it, gone toward an actual emergency, only toward whatever expense had presented itself most recently. I redirected that money into an actual retirement account for the first time since I'd started working, and watching the balance grow instead of drain felt, some months, like the closest thing I had to proof that anything had really changed. I had the locks changed on my own apartment, not because Marcus had ever come for that spare key, but because the asking for it had taught me something about how easily access gets requested from people who are used to being given it. It's been 8 months now. I live in a 2-bedroom on the east side of Columbus, furnished entirely with things I chose and paid for and intend to keep. My mother and I talk sometimes, brief phone calls that stay carefully on the surface of things, birthdays and weather, and the small, safe territory two people can still share when everything underneath it has changed. My father and I don't talk at all, not out of cruelty, just because neither of us has found a version of conversation yet that doesn't eventually arrive back at the deed. Grandma Dorothy calls me every Sunday at exactly 4 o'clock, and I've started driving her to her doctor's appointments myself, which she says is more than any of you ever offered before, though I think she means it as a compliment to me rather than an insult to anyone else. She's taken to slipping me $20 bills again at the end of our visits, the same way she used to at Christmas, and I've stopped arguing with her about it. Some gestures aren't meant to be balanced, they're meant to be received. Chloe and I exchange a text every month or two, polite, unresolved, the shape of a relationship neither of us has decided how to finish. I made partner track at Bennett and Cole this spring, a promotion that had nothing to do with any of this, and everything to do with the fact that I finally had the energy to chase it, once I'd stopped spending so much of myself keeping other people's lights on. Priya took me out to celebrate at a little Indian place near the office, and somewhere between the second round of chai and the bill, she raised her glass and said, "To the audit that finally balanced," and I laughed harder than the joke probably deserved, because she was right in a way she only half meant. I bought myself a real couch that spring too, not out of anniversary or occasion, just because I wanted one, deep green, the kind of piece nobody in my family would ever have chosen for me. I sat on it the first night with a glass of wine and no one to report to about how I'd spent my evening, and I remember thinking, clearly, that this was what the 6 weeks had actually been for. Not the television, not the refrigerator. This, a room that owed nothing to anyone. I still think about Grandma Dorothy's word, fairness, more than almost anything else that came out of that year. She never once told me she was sorry on my parents' behalf, and I don't think she should have, since the apology was never hers to give. What she gave me instead was smaller and more useful. She looked at the whole situation, plainly, and called it what it was, and let that be enough. I've tried to learn that from her. I've tried to stop needing my father to agree with my version of events before I'm allowed to trust it. I think about that dinner sometimes, my mother's wine glass catching the light, her voice saying we can only afford one ticket, like affording had ever really been the question. They chose Chloe for Spain because choosing Chloe had always been easier, and because somewhere along the way they'd stopped believing I needed to be chosen at all. I understand now that being called steady, being called the strong one, was never the compliment I thought it was. It was a job description, and I'd been working it, unpaid, for a decade. I don't regret what I did in that house. I regret, some nights, that it had to be the thing that finally made them see me. I regret that the only language my family ever fully understood was the language of what was missing, and that I had to empty an entire house before anyone noticed I'd been the one filling it all along. Some nights I still catch myself doing the math out of habit, adding up what a year of real honesty might have cost my parents compared to what 10 years of silence ended up costing me. It never comes out even. It was never going to. That, I think, is the part nobody warns you about when they talk about setting boundaries with family. It doesn't feel like winning. It feels like closing a set of books that never should have been kept open in the first place, and grieving quietly for the version of the ledger you always hoped you'd get to write instead. They chose my sister for Spain. I chose myself for everything that came after, and if I'm honest, that's the trip that actually changed my life.